effect, the machinery Rockefeller had set in motion more than a century earlier had become untouchable, not because it was invincible, but because it was now indistinguishable from the very fabric of global finance itself. The investigations, scattered, incomplete, and often abandoned, did have consequences. The Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Act, and a series of banking reforms in the 1930s were all in part responses to Rockefeller's overwhelming influence. But none of these measures address the deeper issue, the immortality of capital. By the mid-20th century, Rockefeller-style dynastic trusts had become standard practice for the wealthy elite. They offered a way not only to pass on fortunes but to shield them from taxation, regulation, and public scrutiny. Entire sections of U.S. tax code were quietly shaped by Rockefeller-appointed lobbyists to ensure that the line, though never named, remained intact. Other powerful families took note. The DuPonts, the Mellons, the Fords all adopted similar structures. In Europe, the Rothschilds and Agnellis refined them further. Even state actors mimicked the model, creating sovereign wealth funds that operated under similar principles. And with each generation, the original intent, to perpetuate wealth as a vessel of power, drifted further from public view. It became normalized, bureaucratized, hidden beneath layers of legal jargon and corporate complexity. The horror lay not in what was illegal, but in what was perfectly lawful. Perhaps the most disturbing implication of all is not the machinery itself, but humanity's relationship to it. Time and again, society has chosen comfort over confrontation. Governments have looked the other way. Populations have celebrated philanthropy while ignoring its darker motives. Why? Because the promise of benevolence, of libraries, vaccines, scholarships, and research, dulls the instinct to question. The same hand that built hospitals also built mechanisms of control. The same fortune that funded public health initiatives also funded eugenics experiments. And still, the public prefers the comforting narrative of generosity to the terrifying reality of dominion. By the end of the 20th century, the structure Rockefeller conceived had become self-sustaining. It no longer required the will of any single man. The system's logic was encoded into trusts, foundations, and international agreements. It was, in every meaningful sense, alive, an organism that fed on capital, replicated itself across borders, and evolved beyond the mortality of those who had created it. In 1896, Rockefeller once said, "I believe the power to make money is a gift from God, and to be developed and used to the best of our ability. But if wealth is a gift, it is one that has outgrown its giver. It has become its own deity, one that demands sacrifice, loyalty, and continuity. And like all ancient gods, it does not die. It waits." Before we conclude this chilling journey into the hidden machinery of power, we want to hear from you. What do you think truly drove John D. Rockefeller? Greed, belief, or something far more disturbing? Do you think such a system could exist today, unseen but ever present? Share your theories in the comments below. We read everyone, and if you haven't already, subscribe to The Lost Fear and ring that notification bell. Because the next chapter of history's darkest secrets might be even closer to the present than you think. By 1990, more than 5 decades after John D. Rockefeller's death, the original man had long since returned to dust. And yet, his wealth, his structures, his philosophies continued not merely to exist, but to grow. The system he engineered did not slow with his passing. It accelerated. It evolved. It began to resemble something beyond human ambition, an algorithm of power, self-replicating and self-correcting. And in this final phase of our investigation, we must confront the most unsettling question of all. Was Rockefeller's fortune ever really about wealth? Or was wealth only the instrument, the scalpel used to carve something far larger into the fabric of civilization itself? A trust does not age. A foundation does not die. A corporate charter, once inked, outlives the names on its documents. By the late 20th century, the legal architecture Rockefeller pioneered had achieved something humans have always craved but never truly attained: immortality without flesh. It did not require belief, ritual, or willpower. It required only structure, precise clauses, carefully written bylaws, and interlocking governance that ensured one board could seamlessly replace another, one trustee succeed the previous, without ever disrupting the continuity of purpose. A 1987 tax court decision put it bluntly. The Rockefeller trusts demonstrate the principle of perpetual fiduciary continuity. In practical terms, they behave as living entities. The language was legal. The implication was not. These living entities had no conscience, no morality, no capacity for regret. And yet they acted, funding policies, steering research, influencing generations. The men and women who sat on their boards changed over time. Their ideologies shifted, but the system did not. It obeyed the logic written into it a century before. Preserve the wealth, extend the influence. Ensure continuity. Not all questions can be answered, and perhaps that is the most terrifying truth of all. In 1978, a small team of archivists cataloging the Rockefeller family archives in Sleepy Hollow, New York, discovered a sealed vault marked simply FR Private. According to internal correspondence, it contained early correspondence, unpublished journals, and private memoranda spanning 1870-1930. It remains sealed to this day. Access is restricted to direct family descendants and select trustees. When the historian Dr. Lydia Grant petitioned for access in 1989, she received a single-sentence reply. The materials are of a private and familial nature and not germane to the historical record. But what, exactly, would a family fear revealing after more than a century? Some historians speculate the vault may contain the original Covenant of Basel, the complete version, not the fragments seen in later documents. Others believe it holds evidence of early coordination with eugenic research programs in Germany and the United States, programs that predated and perhaps inspired those of the Third Reich. We cannot know. And that absence, that carefully maintained unknowing, is itself a kind of power. The most haunting interpretation of Rockefeller's system comes not from political science or economics, but from sociology, specifically the concept of institutional immortality. The idea is simple, yet profoundly disturbing. Once a structure accumulates enough wealth, legal protection, and social legitimacy, it ceases to serve its original creators. It becomes a self-directed entity with objectives that evolve independently of the humans involved. In 1985, sociologist Dr. Miriam Gosner described the Rockefeller legacy this way. It is not that Rockefeller lives on through his fortune. It is that the fortune itself has become a kind of organism, an organism whose purpose is survival, growth, and influence. Humans are no longer the masters of it. They are the caretakers. And caretakers, as history has shown, are replaceable. The horror is not that one man became the wealthiest in history. The horror is that he built something that no man, not even his descendants, can now fully control. In 1989, nearly a century after the original meeting in Basel, a private gathering was held at the Rockefeller estate at Pocantico Hills. The guest list included senior figures from banking, energy, and biotech industries. No media were present. No minutes were published. The only record of the event comes from a leaked itinerary obtained by the New York Ledger in 1992, which referred to the meeting under a single cryptic heading. Continuatio. The Latin word translates to continuation. It is also the same word used in the closing paragraph of the 1912 Basel Agreement, the pact that bound a small circle of industrial dynasties to a mission of perpetual economic control. No, one outside that circle knows what was discussed at Pocantico. But shortly afterward, a new wave of foundations, trusts, and philanthropic consortia appeared, each with governance structures eerily similar to those established in 1912. Coincidence? Or the next phase of a plan conceived over a century earlier? If this story unsettles us, it is because it exposes something deeply uncomfortable about human nature itself. We like to believe that evil requires villains, men with cruel intentions and monstrous desires. But what if evil can emerge from something as banal as a legal document? What if the true horror is not malice but momentum, the slow, relentless expansion of a structure that began with a single man's ambition and has since become unstoppable? We have accepted its hospitals and museums. We have benefited from its scholarships and scientific grants. We have celebrated its philanthropy without asking why that philanthropy was necessary in the first place. And each time we accepted, we strengthened the organism. We fed it. We made it part of the very society it now shapes. In the end, the horror is not that Rockefeller created a system that will not die. The horror is that we allowed it to live. There is an entry, little known, often dismissed as apocryphal, in one of Rockefeller's final letters to his son, dated July 12, 1935. It is a short passage, written in his increasingly frail handwriting, and it reads, "A man dies twice, once when his body ceases, and once when his name is spoken no more. But a third death exists, a death of purpose, and that I intend to deny." By the time Standard Oil was dissolved in 1911 under the Sherman Antitrust Act, John D. Rockefeller had already anticipated the blow. The trust was dismantled into 34 separate companies, many of which, Standard Oil of New Jersey, later Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, Mobil, Standard Oil of California, Chevron, would go on to become even more powerful than the original. The press called it a legal victory, but a small circle inside the U.S. Senate Committee on Interstate Commerce believed something deeper was afoot. In 1913, Senator Robert La Follette privately circulated a memorandum suggesting that the breakup was a shell game, designed to conceal wealth rather than destroy monopoly power. "Standard Oil is not dead," La Follette wrote. "It has simply learned to change its skin." Subpoenas were issued for internal company records. Testimony was sought from former executives. But time and again, investigators ran into a wall of obfuscation. Many documents had been lost in transit or accidentally destroyed. Witnesses claimed they could not recall. And curiously, critical pieces of financial evidence had been transferred overseas, beyond the reach of American courts. One internal Justice Department memo from October 1913, declassified decades later, revealed a chilling conclusion. The central structure appears to have no center. Remove one node and the others continue operating autonomously. The design is intentional. It was the first official recognition that Rockefeller's empire had evolved beyond a corporation into something more akin to a living network. 2 decades later, during the Great Depression, public anger toward concentrated wealth surged once again. Representative Louis T. McFadden chaired a House investigation into the influence of private capital on U.S. monetary policy. His focus quickly turned to Rockefeller-linked banks and foundations, many of which had played key roles in shaping Federal Reserve policy. McFadden's committee uncovered evidence that Rockefeller-controlled trusts were funding policy think tanks, university economics departments, and even congressional research offices, subtly steering debates on monetary reform. But the most explosive allegation came from a Treasury Department whistleblower who claimed that certain Rockefeller accounts were never subject to federal audit, on the grounds that they were international holdings. "We are not merely dealing with wealthy individuals," McFadden warned in a 1934 floor speech. "We are dealing with a structure that transcends law, nationality, and sovereignty itself." His warnings fell on deaf ears. Within months, McFadden lost his chairmanship. Several key witnesses recanted under pressure, and the investigation fizzled. Historians still debate whether this was due to lack of evidence or coordinated suppression. One surviving internal memo, signed by Attorney General Homer Cummings, hints at the latter. Further pursuit of these matters risks destabilizing public confidence in both our financial system and our government. It is recommended that we desist. The discovery of the Rockefeller journals in 1937 prompted renewed interest from federal authorities. The Treasury Department, in collaboration with the Bureau of Investigation, later the FBI, launched a discreet inquiry in early 1938. The focus, to determine whether the convergences described in the journals constituted a criminal conspiracy or a threat to national security. Investigators quickly encountered anomalies. Subpoenaed documents vanished before they could be examined. Bank accounts known to exist in Basel and Hamburg were suddenly liquidated and transferred to anonymous trusts in Liechtenstein. A Treasury field report from June 1939 captured the frustration. "We are chasing shadows. Every time we close in on one entity, it dissolves and reforms elsewhere. It is as if the structure anticipates our moves before we make them." One curious episode illustrates just how deep the interference ran. A junior investigator named Thomas Keene, who had been tracking suspicious fund transfers linked to the Rockefeller Foundation, disappeared while on assignment in New York in September 1939. His body was found weeks later in the East River. The death was ruled a suicide. His colleagues, however, were not convinced. Keene had left behind a series of notes, one of which read simply, "The covenant is real." They still gather. The Cleveland inquiry was quietly shelved in 1940, just as the United States was preparing for entry into World War II. The official reason: insufficient evidence. Unofficially, many in government believed the risk of exposing the true nature of the Rockefeller apparatus outweighed any possible legal gains. In the aftermath of World War II, attention shifted across the Atlantic. Allied investigators conducting Operation Safe Haven, a mission to trace Nazi assets hidden abroad, stumbled upon a network of shell companies linked to both German industrialists and American financiers. Among them, several entities with ties to Rockefeller-controlled foundations and trusts. One Safe Haven report, dated March 1947, observed, "There is evidence to suggest that certain American foundations acted as conduits for the transfer of assets and possibly biological research between German and American institutions before and during the war." The revelations were explosive, but political pressure quickly suppressed them. With the onset of the Cold War, Western governments prioritized economic stability and alliance building over uncomfortable truths. Documents implicating major American families were sealed under national security exemptions. However, not all evidence was buried. A 1951 parliamentary inquiry in Britain revealed that Rockefeller-linked banks had helped finance post-war reconstruction projects that doubled as fronts for covert research into human genetics. Though legal, these actions raised ethical alarms. A member of Parliament, Sir William Beveridge, famously asked, "At what point does philanthropy become dominion? And who gave these men the right to decide the course of our species?" The accidental discovery of the ritual chamber beneath the Rockefeller estate in 1952 sparked a brief, intense wave of public interest before being abruptly contained. Local reporters who attempted to investigate the site were barred from the property by private security. County officials were instructed that the matter concerns national interests. The FBI's involvement was particularly revealing. Though the Bureau initially dispatched agents to examine the chamber, internal communications show that Director J. Edgar Hoover personally ordered the case closed. A memorandum to the White House, declassified in 1998, stated, "Further public scrutiny of this site would serve no purpose. There is no evidence of criminal activity, only the eccentricities of a wealthy family. National security considerations advise against further inquiry." The chamber was sealed, photographed, and quietly forgotten. But those who had seen it firsthand described it as unsettling and ceremonial. One agent's field report, redacted but partially legible, concluded with a haunting line, "This was not built for any earthly transaction. This was built for continuity." The revelation of the Codex Continuitas in 1974 reignited debate within European regulatory circles. The Swiss Federal Council launched a confidential commission to investigate possible collusion between dynastic banking families. Their report, completed in 1980, was never released to the public, but a leaked summary paints a disturbing picture. The commission identified at least 12 interlinked family trusts operating across 5 jurisdictions, all bound by agreements dating back to the early 20th century. These trusts controlled stakes in more than 300 companies, including several multinational banks, mining firms, and pharmaceutical conglomerates. Many of these entities shared common board members, some of whom were direct descendants of the original signatories of the Basel Pact. The Commission's most startling conclusion was philosophical rather than legal. The accumulation and perpetuation of capital in this manner suggests a deliberate attempt to transcend the limitations of human lifespan. Wealth here is not an inheritance. It is a vessel for immortality. Switzerland declined to prosecute, citing a lack of legal framework to address what it called intergenerational strategic continuity. Other words, nothing Rockefeller or his counterparts had done was technically illegal. The last significant attempt to investigate Rockefeller influence occurred in Britain in the late 1980s, spurred by mounting evidence of transatlantic collusion. A parliamentary committee summoned experts to testify on the role of private dynasties in shaping economic policy. Among the most compelling witnesses was Dr. Alistair Hughes, a historian who had spent 20 years researching elite networks. In his testimony, Hughes argued that the Rockefeller system had evolved beyond capitalism into something more akin to a closed-loop ecosystem. "We are no longer dealing with families or corporations. We are dealing with self-perpetuating organisms. They grow, adapt, and protect themselves, not for the sake of any individual, but for the sake of the system itself. The hearings made headlines but achieved little. Proposed legislation to regulate intergenerational trusts died in committee. The final report, issued in 1989, concluded blandly. There is no evidence of unlawful conduct, though there remain concerns regarding transparency and accountability. In the spring of 1907, amidst one of the most severe financial panics in U.S. history, Rockefeller vanished from public view for nearly 6 weeks. Newspapers speculated he was ill or retreating from the chaos. But diplomatic records from the U.S. consulate in Basel, Switzerland tell a different story. They place Rockefeller in the city during a series of meetings that coincided with the founding of the Bank for International Settlements precursor, a financial consortium quietly pooling gold reserves from the world's wealthiest families. One hotel register from the Grand Hotel Les Trois. Royce contains a signature matching Rockefeller's, but beneath his name is a strange annotation written in Latin. Non terminus sed origo. Translation, not the end, but the origin. A report filed by an American attaché, later uncovered in the National Archives, notes the unusual nature of these gatherings. Meetings reportedly extended past midnight, and on several occasions, attendants were instructed to bring no artificial light into the chamber, only oil lamps arranged in a specific triangular pattern. Witnesses described hearing chanting in multiple tongues from behind heavy oak doors. One hotel employee, Friedrich Adler, claimed that upon entering the room after one such meeting, he observed a floor map marked not with political boundaries, but with blood-red concentric circles radiating outward from Cleveland, Ohio, the birthplace of Standard Oil. The following week, Rockefeller's representatives announced significant new investments in European energy markets, partnerships that allowed the family to bypass emerging antitrust laws. The timing was no coincidence, nor was the fact that these deals bound Rockefeller's wealth to institutions that still exist today, including Deutsche Bank and Baring Brothers, many of which remain controlled by dynastic bloodlines. It was as though a new, transnational organism had been born, one that fed not merely on oil, but on the flow of power itself, and its heartbeat pulsed in patterns no government could fully trace. By 1912, Rockefeller had become synonymous with philanthropy. The family's name adorned universities, medical institutes, and charitable organizations. Yet buried deep within the archives of the Rockefeller Foundation, historians would later discover a memorandum unlike any other, labeled simply Charter 42. The document outlined a global strategy for what it called human capital refinement, while publicly presented as a scientific plan to eradicate disease and improve public health. The language quickly veered into darker territory. It is not enough to extend life, we must shape it. To ensure continuity, we must sculpt the generations that will inherit industry and govern the flow. The memorandum listed more than a dozen European and American research institutions slated for funding, many of which became central to the early eugenics movement. Among them was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics in Berlin, a facility that, decades later, would inform Nazi racial policy. A diary entry from Rockefeller's chief scientific advisor, Dr. Raymond Pearl, adds a chilling footnote. Dated March 4, 1913, it reads, "The benefactor spoke again today of legacy, not the inheritance of wealth, but the inheritance of will. It is not enough that our name endures. It must endure in the blood." Though no law was broken, Charter 42 reveals a philosophy that went far beyond philanthropy. It envisioned wealth not merely as an economic force, but as a tool to engineer humanity itself, to direct its evolution in service of a dynastic vision, and yet the public remained largely unaware. Newspapers celebrated Rockefeller's generosity. Universities named halls and libraries after him. Doctors praised his institutes for their breakthroughs in medicine. All the while, a hidden hand quietly shaped policies and ideologies that would ripple across the 20th century. If this story is unsettling you, if the thought of unimaginable wealth being used not just to control markets but to shape human destiny gives you chills, hit that like button right now. It helps our community of mystery seekers grow. And share this video with someone who thinks they know the story of Rockefeller Because the truth is only getting darker from here. The most damning evidence of all did not surface until decades later. In October 1937, as mentioned in our opening, a sealed iron chest was discovered beneath the floorboards of a disused Standard Oil warehouse in Cleveland. Inside were 17 journals spanning more than 40 years of Rockefeller's life. Private writings never meant to be seen by the public. The contents stunned investigators. In precise, almost clinical handwriting, Rockefeller described gatherings he called convergences, attended by a closed circle of industrialists, bankers, and scientists. These meetings, often held during solar eclipses or equinoxes, were described not as business negotiations, but as renewals. On this night, as the shadow crosses the sun, we rebind the current. The root strengthens, the vessel endures. The journals contained extensive references to what Rockefeller called the line, a concept that blended economic theory, biological science, and something far older. The line, he wrote, was not just the transmission of wealth through inheritance, but the transmission of purpose. One chilling passage from Volume 9, dated September 23, 1903, reads, "Wealth is not a possession. It is a vessel. We are its keepers. The line must be sustained even if the vessel perishes. Flesh is expendable. Continuity is not." The hidden chamber beneath Pocantico Hills in 1952, 15 years after the chest discovery, a construction crew renovating the Rockefeller estate at Pocantico Hills, New York, stumbled upon an unmarked subterranean chamber. The room, sealed behind a false wall, contained a circular stone table carved with astrological symbols and a Latin inscription, Ex sanguine perpetuitas, from blood, perpetuity. In the center of the chamber was a glass display case holding a set of 5 quill pens and a leather-bound volume labeled The Covenant. Though its pages were largely blank, chemical analysis revealed faint traces of human hemoglobin, evidence that the pens had been dipped in blood. A note pinned to the inner cover read, "Those who sign do so in body and in bond. The current flows through them and beyond them." The estate's caretakers quickly sealed the room, and no public announcement was ever made. But the records of Westchester County confirm the chamber's existence. The discovery was quietly reported to federal authorities who, after a brief investigation, declared it a private family matter and sealed the files for 75 years. The next revelation surfaced thousands of miles away. In 1974, a group of Swiss historians cataloging documents in the archives of Basler Handelsbank uncovered a manuscript referred to as the Codex Continuitas. The text, written in a mixture of Latin, German, and English, appears to be a transcript of a 1907 meeting, possibly the very one Rockefeller attended during the Panic of 1907. The Codex outlines a multi-generational pact among 12 families, including the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, Warburgs, and Montagus, to safeguard the flow through coordinated control of global finance, resource extraction, and biological stewardship. One passage, attributed to Rockefeller himself, is particularly disturbing. "Wealth, like blood, must circulate, and like blood, if it stops, it dies. We are its heart." The Codex also describes rituals performed during these meetings, offerings of symbolic seed and sinew meant to bind the signatories to their collective purpose. Whether these rituals were metaphorical or literal remains unclear, but the tone is unmistakably reverent, even religious. In 1991, a retired MI5 officer named Sir Edmund Blackley gave a confidential deposition regarding his work surveilling foreign financial influence in Britain during the Cold War. Among his claims was a startling allegation that the Rockefeller family, through a series of offshore trusts and private councils, continued to participate in convergences well into the 1970s, this time in London's underground Masonic halls. Blackley described one such meeting in chilling detail. They spoke not of markets or profits, but of succession, not merely inheritance, but selection. It was clear that these gatherings were about more than money. They were about continuity at a level that bordered on the theological. His report was dismissed by British authorities as unsubstantiated, but private correspondence between MI5 and the U.S. State Department, declassified in 2014, confirms that elements of his testimony aligned with intelligence assessments about coordinated wealth dynasties operating outside traditional nation-state frameworks. October 28, 1937, in the damp archives of a disused Standard Oil storage facility on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio, city officials cataloging property records stumbled upon a sealed iron chest buried beneath the floorboards. Inside were not contracts or ledgers as they expected, but a series of leather-bound journals, each embossed with the initials JDR. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. It belonged to John Davison Rockefeller, the man hailed as America's first billionaire. But these were no ordinary records of business or philanthropy. The pages spoke of ritual gatherings beneath the earth, of the unbroken line that must never be severed, and of a chilling doctrine that wealth, properly concentrated, could defy the decay of time itself. One entry, dated June 3, 1913, read simply, "The blood of the venture must be renewed, not only by inheritance, but by design." What investigators would uncover over the next several months would shake the myth of the self-made magnate to its core. For behind the fortune that built America's oil empire lay something far older, far darker, and far more enduring than money. But the truth was far more terrifying. Before we uncover the truth about Rockefeller's wealth and the chilling forces that may still sustain it, make sure to subscribe to The Lost Fear and ring that notification bell so you never miss another descent into forgotten history. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community of mystery seekers. Now, let us return to where this all began. The year was 1839, and the United States was a nation on the brink of transformation. Railroads snaked across vast, untamed landscapes, steamships conquered rivers, and industry, once confined to New England workshops, had begun to dominate entire cities. Wealth was no longer a product of noble birth, but of ruthless ambition and technological innovation. It was into this turbulent, opportunity-laden world that John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York. The son of William Avery Rockefeller, a traveling salesman and self-proclaimed botanic physician, John grew up amidst deception and duplicity. His father, known locally as Devil Bill, was a notorious con artist, a man who sold fake cures and fled towns before debts came due. "I cheat my boys every chance I get," Devil Bill once bragged. "I want to make 'em sharp." The lesson took hold. By his teenage years, John Rockefeller had developed a near-religious devotion to money, not as a tool, but as a force. In his own words, penned decades later, "The man who starts out simply with the idea of getting rich won't succeed. You must have a larger ambition." That larger ambition took form in Cleveland, Ohio, where Rockefeller, alongside partners Maurice Clark and Samuel Andrews, founded what would become Standard Oil in 1870. Within 2 decades, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of America's oil refining industry, a stranglehold so complete that politicians, journalists, and even rival magnates whispered of a private government more powerful than Washington itself. But behind the story of efficiency and ruthless business strategy lurked stranger rumors. Local clerks reported Rockefeller holding midnight meetings in the basements of Cleveland churches. Employees whispered that certain key contracts were signed only after ceremonies involving unlit rooms, candles, and what one janitor described as old words spoken in a language no one recognized. Most dismissed these as superstition, the inevitable myths surrounding a man of near-mythic power. And yet, even in his lifetime, Rockefeller appeared to defy nature itself. He lived to 97, surviving ailments and operations that would have felled lesser men. Newspapers marveled at his iron constitution. Few questioned how a man who had been frail as a boy, prone to fevers and fatigue, could, by his 90s, still rise before dawn and review financial reports with the precision of a man half his age. Still fewer questioned why. Even as Standard Oil was broken apart by the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1911, Rockefeller's fortune continued to grow. Despite losing his monopoly, his wealth expanded, doubling, then tripling, as if something beyond market logic was at work. A chilling observation from the New York Herald, written in 1914, hinted at the unease. Even when cut down, the roots of the Rockefeller fortune seemed to deepen. Sever one limb, and 3 more sprout in its place. It was during these years that Rockefeller began channeling his immense resources into philanthropic foundations, institutions that, on the surface, aimed to cure disease, reform education, and uplift humanity. Yet many of these initiatives, historians now note, carried an unsettling undercurrent. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, founded in 1901, poured vast sums into the study of heredity and racial hygiene. At a time when the eugenics movement was gaining momentum in the United States and Europe, Rockefeller money quietly funded studies that would later influence Germany's racial policies in the 1930s. In a private letter dated February 12, 1924, a Rockefeller Foundation officer wrote, "We must ensure the vitality of the stock upon which civilization depends. This is philanthropy of the highest order. Philanthropy, or something far more sinister." By the 1920s, Rockefeller's influence extended beyond business and science. Through intricate banking relationships, he forged ties with powerful European dynasties, notably the Rothschilds and the Warburgs, whose wealth, like his own, seemed to transcend generations. The meetings between these families, often conducted in private estates in London, Basel, and Geneva, were seldom documented. But one surviving memorandum from a 1928 gathering at Château de Prigny in Switzerland spoke, ominously, of a compact to guard the bloodline of enterprise and bind the current to the source. The first documented anomaly tied to Rockefeller's empire surfaced in the early 1870s during Standard Oil's rapid expansion. In March 1872, an internal audit uncovered a series of unexplained ledger entries marked with a simple sigil, a circle intersected by 3 vertical lines, instead of the usual signature. These transactions, totaling over $1.2 million, roughly $30 million today, were transferred to accounts in Hamburg, London, and Basel, but no recipient could be identified. When questioned, Rockefeller reportedly replied, "It is a family matter." No further explanation was ever offered. A century later, when the archives of the First Cleveland Bank were declassified, researchers discovered that the accounts linked to those mysterious transfers were never closed. In fact, they remain active to this day, steadily accruing interest under shell entities that trace back to no living owner. 2 decades later, another strange episode emerged, this time from within Rockefeller's inner circle. In 1892, a disgruntled former Standard Oil accountant named Elias Mercer filed a sworn affidavit with the Cuyahoga County Court, alleging that he had witnessed a binding ceremony conducted by Rockefeller and several unnamed associates. According to Mercer's testimony, the event took place in the basement of a private residence on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, known as Millionaire's Row. There, by candlelight and beneath a series of engraved sigils, the participants pricked their fingers and signed a document, not with ink, but with blood. Mercer claimed the agreement contained a chilling clause: the flow must never cease. When the body is dust, the current endures. The affidavit was dismissed as delusional. Mercer was later institutionalized for nervous exhaustion, but the document he described does appear in the Rockefeller family's sealed archives, referenced cryptically in a 1939 inventory list as the original covenant. Its contents remain classified to this day. Nearly a century later, it seems he succeeded. His name endures. His wealth multiplies. His influence pervades everything from science to policy to the very air of philanthropy, and his purpose, to extend control beyond the limits of life, has not died. It has only changed form. As the lights dim on this chapter of hidden history, we are left with a question that is far older and far darker than John D. Rockefeller himself. If wealth can become immortal, if power can evolve beyond the reach of law, morality, and time, then who truly governs the world we live in? Is it the governments we elect, the institutions we trust, or is it the unseen machinery humming beneath the surface, driven by a logic set in motion by men long dead? Men whose intentions we no longer remember, yet whose influence we still obey. What authorities discovered next would not be written in any report. It would not appear in any ledger or headline, because it is not a discovery that happens once. It is a truth we live inside every day. What do you believe drives systems like this? Greed, fear, or a deeper instinct for dominance buried within human nature itself? Leave your theories in the comments. Our community of mystery seekers thrives on your insight. And if this story has opened your eyes to the hidden structures of power, subscribe to The Lost Fear and ring the bell, because this is just one chapter in a much larger, much darker story. Next time, we'll unseal the archives of another name history refuses to forget, and expose the shadows they left behind. Until then, beware what survives.